Okay, hi everyone. Welcome to Mindgasms, talking to the historian slash podcaster, author, mixed martial artist, and Daoist, Daniele Bolelli, aka the Zen Punisher. And we're going to talk today about the idea I had, which was I talked to you about a little bit about this before, about how I had heard that after Nietzsche died, his sister, who was a Nazi supporter, she heavily edited his final work called The Will to Power to be favorable towards the Nazis, and then Hitler used that in his speeches to convince people of the validity of the Nazi ideology. So I thought that would be really interesting to discuss. So what do you know about like how this came about and kind of the details about that, how much of a Nazi supporter she was and how she went about doing that and how Hitler used it in his speeches and whatnot.
I mean, it's a pretty straightforward story because he didn't really have much of a family. He wasn't married, he didn't have kids, none of that. So she was the closest family. So when he went nuts, then she basically took control of everything associated with his name, edited this series of things he had written, turned it into more what she wanted and not, and essentially used it as something that would be much more Nazi friendly than what Nietzsche wrote. So it's really a pretty dramatic transformation compared to what Nietzsche. I mean, if you read Nietzsche for 5 minutes, you realize that there was nothing Nazi about him. It's like the guy was, if anything, he was very distrustful of a powerful state, which is kind of the antithesis of a ultra authoritarian regime like what the Nazis set up. So, if anything, Nietzsche, if you want to pinpoint him politically, he had much more of an anarchist vibe than he did a Nazi one. So far, far, far from that. So took a lot of editing on our part to make it work, to make it a little more Nazi friendly. And the Nazis did the way anybody does with books they like, which is they take some of the stuff that they like, they ignore all the stuff that doesn't work. So, you selectively cut and paste a few quotes here and there, and you can pretend that it supports what you're saying, which is kind of, I mean, if you think about it, that's what most people do with religion anyway. They take the Bible or the Quran, they take 15% of the book, cut and paste. That's what the real Christianity or real Islam is. And then you look at it, it's like, yeah, but there's the next page that contradicts what you just said, so it doesn't really work. Well, we're not going to look at that part and leave it alone. It's kind of how it works.
Right. Yeah, that makes sense. So what do you know about it's you said that he's like Nietzsche was more of an anarchist, and I what do you know about because it seems like based on what I've read and what I've heard, that like some people claim that Nietzsche was anti-Semitic, but it seems like that was kind of not true. But it also seems like I've heard like quotes that sounded like vaguely anti-Semitic, but then others that sound like the complete opposite of that. So what do you think about that?
So there are 2 points to that. One, the fact that a lot of the quote unquote anti Semitic stuff is more that he really did not like he had issues with the Judeo Christian tradition, religiously speaking. So that's kind of where a
Yeah,
lot of them
certainly.
come from. So he hammers hard on some issues, but they are more about religion than are about anything else. That's one aspect. The other aspect is that we got to remember that as brilliant as Nietzsche was in many ways, he ended up nuts for a reason. I find the idea, I find that people who look for a system in Nietzsche's thought are kind of missing the point. To me, Nietzsche is a poet more than a philosopher with a coherent plan from A to Z. So he's throwing a lot of shit at the wall, and some of it sticks and a lot of it doesn't. And that doesn't make the rest of his stuff less brilliant. There's some genius stuff in there, but there's also a lot of quotes where he's really throwing it out there, and it doesn't really, like, there are parts of Nietzsche's that are, you read them today and you're like, Jesus Christ, what was your issue then? Why were you saying? And that's part of the gig, right? He's not all this neatly refined structure where everything has been planned perfectly. Some parts are dumb. Some parts don't come across well. Some parts where he writes the opposite the next day. So people who are trying to turn it into this perfectly coherent system, I think they are barking up the wrong tree there.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, like you said, I forget which. Oh yeah, one of his most famous books, The Antichrist. He's obviously super against religion in that one. Like, he sounds like a modern day militant atheist, like Sam Harris or someone like that in that book. And yeah, I forget what the main title is, but one of his books, the subtitle of which is Philosophy with a Hammer. I think his idea in that book was to just like dispense his complex philosophy into a lot of really concise statements, and he deliberately doesn't unpack them. So it's like a lot of them are pretty open to interpretation in that sense.
Yeah. That's why I'm like, Nietzsche should be read more like poetry than an organized philosophy. And with poetry, you're gonna run into great lines, and then sometime it's like maybe some editing would have been good because these came out really bad, kind of thing. I mean, there are some, for example, there are a bunch of
for sure.
about women that you read them today, and you're like, Jesus, man. I mean, I understand you grew up in Germany in the 1800s. I understand what the average woman was like at that time, but still, they are not his best thoughts. Let's put it that way.
Yeah, for sure. That's one thing I was thinking about too. And also I was just thinking, like some of his statements too, I think people could confuse that for anti-Semitism, because sometimes he's talking about, like, he uses phrases like the German ideology, or he's talking about that sort of thing. And it seems like he's talking about, he's kind of talking about the work of other German philosophers, but it kind of seems to me like he's just kind of like you were saying before, taking the things that interest him about those philosophers and then discarding the things that he doesn't like. And one of the issues with that is that Heidegger, of course, is one of the most famous philosophers, and I think he has a lot of really interesting thoughts. But then he was also infamously a supporter of the Nazi Party, so it can be understandably confusing if you're saying like favorable things about Heidegger and favorable things about the so-called German ideology, because people could think that you're meaning the Nazi ideology, I think.
Sure. That in that sense, yeah. But again, when you look at like how anti-authoritarian he was, how much of a strong emphasis on the individual and all of that, that like doesn't, you wouldn't last 3 seconds in the Nazi Party with that.
Yeah. That's why that's why I read this book by Stephen Hicks, who is a Randian objectivist, who also wrote this book called Explaining Postmodernism, which I think gets postmodernism totally wrong and takes people like Foucault and Derrida out of context and gets the sentiment of their arguments totally backwards. He also wrote this book called Nietzsche and the Nazis, which some of it was interesting because I learned more about the Nazi ideology than I had before, but he was also basically making the argument that Nietzsche was anti-Semitic, and like his central argument that like you were saying, I find that like essentially just kind of really fucking stupid, because he was so like anti-authoritarian and he didn't seem like he was actually anti-Semitic, like you were saying.
Yeah, it's a lot more complicated than that. And now there's another thing that's worth addressing. I read Nietzsche primarily in Italian. I read him in an Italian translation from German to Italian. And then I tried to read Nietzsche in translation into English. And man, they suck. Like, on
Oh,
average,
interesting.
the English translations are absolutely awful. Um, like sometimes I've taken small passages that maybe I want to post or I want to quote, and I'm like, I'm looking at the English and I'm like, this is crap. And I go by the Italian translation and I translate it. And, the meaning remains roughly the same, but there's a flavor. Now, I have no idea whether the Italian translation is just a work of genius in itself, and maybe the the original German is not quite as good, or if the Italian is just more faithful to the German and the English translation just blew it all together. But like reading it in Italian and reading it in English, two entirely different experiences. Like I don't know that
Oh,
I would pick up an English translation of Nietzsche and be like, oh, I want to read more of this, because so much of it is needlessly heavy, written in almost a King James style, very full of thou and these. It's like, shut up, it's just terrible for the most part. Whereas the Italian translation has a vibe that's like it's alive. It feels it speaks to you. It's much more immediate. It's much more powerful as a language. So I don't know what that counts for, but I definitely noticed the difference, a big one too.
oh, that's interesting. Hmm. Yeah, I was good. I wonder like if it's like you were saying. I wonder if it's better if it's kind of like the best version in the original German too. And yeah, that I get what you're saying about how the way he uses language can be confusing sometimes because it seems to depend on the book too. Like his writing style seems to vary depending on the book. Like that one philosophy with the hammer, it's like deliberately concise statements, so it's easier to understand. But something that's more kind of like poetic or spiritual, like you were talking about, like his book Thus Spoke Zarathustra. The
Mhm.
first time I read that, and because I've only read the English versions, I totally didn't understand it. I had to look up all of these interpretations that people had to understand it. And then once I read those, I thought, "Oh, this is actually really interesting." But like you were saying, the language was really kind of like obtuse.
And that one is a perfect example because you read that like the way I read it, that was easily his best book and more in every way was more immediate, was more powerful, was more everything. But like with any poetry, if you screw up the way you express it, well, the poetry goes away, and then what you're left with is drier. So it really makes a humongous difference. It's tricky too when you're reading stuff that's not in the original language, unless you speak that other language very well and you can access it. You are really at the mercy of the translator, and that can make a humongous difference.
Yeah, yeah, totally. That's can be a huge issue with a lot of the kind of like obscure so-called continental philosophers that like Nietzsche and Hegel and Heidegger and Foucault and Derrida. Well, they're French, of course, too, but like just translation in general seems to often be an issue in that sense. And then that's part of why it's useful to like see lectures that philosophers do, um, like where they understand the translations. Like I've been watching this series on Hegel's phenomenology of spirit, and with this philosopher Greg Sadler, and he explains some of the translation issues there, and that helps clarify stuff a lot too.
Yeah, I mean, it's sometimes I run into things that the translation is fantastic, is so good that it's even better than the original or close to it at least. Other times, like I'm thinking Nietzsche, I'm thinking one that is really tricky is the Tao Te Ching. That when you read the Tao Te Ching, there are hundreds of translations of the Tao Te Ching, and they range from absolute utter crap that you read a little and you're like, this book sucks, to fantastic and everything in between, right? So it's almost like you need to. Now, the difference is for the Tao Te Ching, you have a bunch of translation and it's short. So you can afford to read several different translations and get the best. Nietzsche in English, not so easy. Not that many translation, much longer body of work. So you cannot have the luxury of just reading one, reading the other, and doing it in that fashion. I really feel like the English-speaking world is lacking a translation of Nietzsche that's as powerful as the Italian version.
Yeah, that's too bad. Yeah, especially since that kind of makes me want to make more progress on learning Italian, because I was like learning it gradually in bits and pieces for a while, but I kind of got out of the habit of it. But I mean, I'm sure something like Nietzsche would be quite a project to take on if it's your second language.
Yeah, and I mean, and also, I mean, if you're going to translate Nietzsche, probably the ideal would be to have to know the German so that you can read it directly in German. That's why, in
Yeah,
fact, I'm not even sure if the Italian translator was just that brilliant that may have even improved on the original, or if it was just that it kept the power of the original in a way that the English doesn't.
yeah, that's interesting. So, so do you know, like around, like how often Hitler used like corruptions of Nietzsche's work in speeches, or like around when that was? Because I think did Nietzsche die like well before World War II? I don't remember for sure. Okay. Yeah.
If I remember correctly, he died in 1900. Check it up as you speak, but I'm pretty sure that it was at the turn of the century.
Okay.
Yeah, 1900. August 25th, 1900. So
right.
before any of that, like 18 years before World War One. So.
Okay, so yeah, his sister had a lot of time to work on that.
Yeah, and he started having his like, let me see when he was put in a psychiatric institution. I believe he was like in the 1880s. Like, yeah, it's basically the last decade. He was pretty much gone. It's in 1889 that he has his mental breakdown. So the last 11 years, it's done.
Yeah, and that certainly kind of, I bet, opened up more opportunities for his sister to alter his work to favor the Nazis.
Definitely. And I mean, so that's, you can see how that happens a lot after his lifetime, because, you know, the Nazis weren't even an idea back then.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, for sure. So, do you think do you think like with the way it was edited, it had it had a lot of success? Because I don't really know much about that.
No, initially, I mean, later, yeah, it will become quoted by the Nazis and all of that. But like Nietzsche, has during his lifetime, he doesn't sell much. You know, it's some of his books are circulated very, very small prints that don't go that far and wide. Which is also part of another reason for his alienation, that he was feeling that he was speaking to himself a whole lot of the time, because there was nobody there, not only not a huge readership, but even among a selected readership, there weren't really people that he clicked with that way, who understood where he was going, who appreciated it, so he definitely felt alienated.
Oh, okay. Yeah, it's really interesting, and it's sad that Nietzsche kind of like went insane in the last part of his life.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't know, like it seems, well, you know, obviously know way more about historical figures than me. Do you think like if you like there tends to be this pattern where if someone is seen as brilliant and they're spending all this time developing this massive set of ideas or just investigating things, it can make people go crazy if they're smart enough? Or does that have to do with more like, I don't know, like pre-existing psychological conditions or like the environment or a combination of different factors, and it kind of varies.
Yeah, I mean, nobody knows with him. There are all these theories. Was it a side effect of syphilis, which there's not even a proof whether he did or he didn't have? Was it, I heard anything from manic depression to like an initial, like, slow moving brain tumor to, all sort of theories trying to explain it. Could just be that the dude was very sensitive and lived in a time and place that he did not have the kind of meetings in terms of other people around him, of people that he could click with. So he was kind of stuck in the prison of his own mind a lot of the time without any outlet. And that didn't help him much. Could be a bunch of factors, very, very hard to tell. And but yeah, by the end, like, you're looking at some of his stuff and you're like, the stuff he was writing at the very end, it's just like, wow, he was out there. And speaking of anti-Semitism, there's a whole thing where he's writing. Granted, he's probably by then pretty crazy, but he's writing like how he was going to have all anti-Semites shot dead and things like that. So it's the exact opposite of anti-Semitism in that regard. But
Oh, okay.
but then he did write some stuff that were, so it's complicated. It gets very complicated.
Yeah, for sure. That tends to often be the case, and uh, obviously, I bet you know much more about this than me. Like, you could say that about maybe many events and historical figures as well. That people have these sort of simplistic narratives, and they get they all, or at least often seem to be a lot more complex than they seem. Like in terms of the Nazis, for example, like I've read a lot of like historical books about World War II, but I haven't read that many of specifically ones that I've heard people talk about a lot in terms of whether like people in Germany in World War II actually believed Hitler's Nazi ideology, or whether the Nazis in particular were just following orders. And like people have written books about both of these theories. And I mean, I'm just guessing, because this seems to often be the case with human behavior, that it's kind of like a mixture of both, and it kind of depends on the person. What would you say about that?
Yeah, I think those are those things that are very hard to generalize. That's why it's, I don't know, it really is one of those things where it's like, good luck coming up with a coherent theory that applies to all cases across the board. Because, I mean, even a single movement, take the Nazis. The Nazis are not a single unified movement with even a coherent ideology. Initially, the Nazis were both left wing and right wing. How's that for a movement that has a coherent logic, And then they
Oh,
started.
I didn't know that.
Yeah, I mean, there was a lot of Nazis. Like, even like, people today would try to paint the Nazis as left wing, which clearly they weren't. They are like, hey, it's a national socialist thing. And it's like, there was a socialist element at the very beginning. They killed them all. They then proceeded to completely eliminate them and turn the Nazi party into something else entirely. So, but at the beginning, even fascism was like that. It wasn't a clear-cut ideology that could be placed in left or right. Eventually becomes super right-wing, but not at first. So, same with the Nazis, same with, like, a lot of these things are, people expect that because there's a label, then there's a clear definition of what it means. It's not always that clear, and that definition usually changes over time.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, I think I'm pretty sure I've seen like multiple podcasts with you and also with Dan Carlin talking about this, how it's really kind of a dumb argument that people use sometimes, how, oh, the Nazis were the National Socialist Party, that makes them left wing.
Yeah, that was dumb. That's really dumb. But yeah, it's one of those things. It's like you selectively take the stuff that you want. You already have a conclusion, and you try to fit the evidence. You take a couple of pieces, ignore everything else, and hey, magically it works. It's like, yeah, not really.
Yeah, for sure. So, um, so you said that they basically like killed all of the more left-leaning Nazis at first. I didn't know about that. So how did it move from like that sort of thing to more of an extreme right-wing ideology?
I mean, because the thing is that usually with these kind of movements, what happens is that they are usually very clear regarding what you are against, but you're not always that clear what you are for. If you look even like something on the opposite extreme, if you look at like the Russian Revolution, it's very clear what everybody was against. Everybody hated the Tsar and the previous regime. But what you are going to replace it with is a different story. Even the early Nazi movement was kind of fuzzy. It was clear what they stood against, wasn't that clear what they were for. And eventually, when you start looking inside and you realize that the difference in sides are almost as big as the difference with the groups you're criticizing, then there's a jockeying for the meaning of what this movement is about, and you have them pulling it one way or another, in some cases in very violent way. I mean, even like the same thing with communism. If you look at communists, they've killed each other forever in the name of which one is the true communism. Religions have done it forever, where they kill within that same tradition in order to establish this is what real Christianity is. No, shut up. This is what real Christianity. It's inevitable. That's why, to me, most labels, political or religious, don't really mean anything, because they, within any one tradition, you can find one thing and its opposite most of the time. So I'm more interested in what kind of Christianity are you talking about? What kind of fascism are you talking about? What kind of communism? Because the word itself is almost too vague to be of use. There's too much inside of it to turn it into a single clear-cut definition.
Yeah, that's interesting. I've been learning a lot more recently about kind of more older like classical anarchists and Marxists too, and kind of like you were saying, all the differences that you can see between the different types of anarchists and Marxists, and like I didn't even know until relatively recently that there's this huge divide in Marxists between people who have like this more authoritarian like Maoist or Stalinist idea that seems to be the stereotype that more right-leaning people go with all the time, that they assume that all Marxists think this way. But then there are some Marxists who um, they want something more like worker controlled co-ops and like democratic control of companies, not like government control of them. And then also I've found it really interesting that a lot of classical anarchists, they were that a lot of them seem super left wing too, like even calling themselves socialist anarchists, and like even using Marxist terms like the Bolsheviks um, and the capitalists and the workers and this essential division, and basically that they think kind of anarchism is the best way of achieving leftist goals, which I think is especially interesting because a lot of like anarchists or libertarians I hear talking today, like they go all the way to anarcho-capitalists, thinking like government is the ultimate evil and it's always more evil than capitalism, which really doesn't make sense to me because like it's not like one is inherently more or less authoritarian than the
Right.
other.
Yeah, if anything, traditional anarchists were more against capitalism than even against government, and they were against government. But like they weren't thinking like. In fact, the whole this is exactly what I mean about labels. The whole ANCAP thing shows you how you can take an idea that was basically considered ultra extreme left wing, and then turn it into something else entirely. So it's like, which one are we talking about? Because it's like that's why to me most of those labels we should really drop them and only use them historically with the meaning of what the way that term was used between this time and that time, because even terms like left wing, right wing, conservative, liberal, it's like half of the time it doesn't mean anything. I'm just like, and
Yeah.
it leads to miscommunication. I'm more like, look, tell me what the idea is, tell me what your policy is about this one thing, and let's figure out which one works. That's what I care about. I don't care where it comes from. I don't care who said it. I don't care. There are problems and there are possible solutions. Let's look at those. Not look at, I don't care about arguing about abstract ideologies. That just seems pointless.
Yeah. Yeah, like you can see, well, like there's always with these like infighting between people within similar political labels. You can see that like with conservatives too, like even their like neoconservatives are almost the opposite of paleoconservatives in some way, and then there are some conservatives who are like really anti-war, and some are huge warmongers and stuff like that too. And yeah, I like to try to take that approach too, just go with like the best ideas wherever they come from. And like if I'm consider when I'm thinking about who I'm going to vote for in an election, I try to look at their policies,
Yeah,
and often there's a lot more similarity than the way that their rhetoric sounds when you watch them speak.
definitely. And I think it's how, I mean, think about it. It's crazy when certain issues that are not at all political, you can already tell how somebody's gonna feel on that issue based on their politics. It's like, Cyril is wearing a mask, a liberal or conservative thing. How fucking stupid is that? It's like, that's not a. It's like, okay, let's look at the science, how far the evidence goes. Then you make a calculation based on the evidence only goes so far, but cost benefit analysis. That's it. There's zero reason why everyone on one side of the equation should be pro and the other against. It just makes no sense. So I'm
Yeah,
just,
yeah, it really does. It's not a political issue at all. And people like it's so ridiculous. Like they're like maybe more left-wing people are like saying science is a sham or some shit like that. And then like more more farther left people make the situation worse by saying like Fauci is science. I'm like, no, a person is not science. It's supposed to be the scientific method
right.
that we're talking about with science. So, like you were saying, like try to evaluate the evidence and weigh the risk of like vaccines and masks for yourself, and do what you think is best. And I mean, it seems to me that like you know masks and vaccinations are a good idea. So that's why I did it. And but then people get far too extreme in either direction to like I have like more but like family members who are a little more progressive than me who think that who like have like violent instincts towards people who they see out not wearing masks or something. And I have more of the mindset of, well, yeah, I agree that it's probably not a good idea for them to not be wearing masks, but I mean, it doesn't make me have murderous impulses towards them or something like that.
Yeah, it becomes completely ideological to a point where, I mean, I was talking to somebody not so long ago who was telling me they had to take a trip that would be like a 2-hour flight. And he was like, no, I'm going to do a 12-hour drive in the name of freedom because I'm not going to wear a mask on the plane. I'm just like, I mean, what does it even? I don't know. It just got so bizarre where it clearly is completely ideological and it's just a matter of like holding on to the purity of your ideological position, where it's just like, I don't know. So I'm kind of like, in general, when it comes to a lot of things, I find that most of the labels that we use to make discussion easier actually complicate discussion, because most things are not one thing. Most political movements don't have a single meaning. Most religions definitely don't have a single meaning. There's so I'm And half of the time it becomes at that point an issue of allegiance. It's like, oh, I heard the label that I like, so I'm gonna support whatever's gonna come out of your mouth now, or I heard the label I don't like, in which case everything is gonna be evil. And it's like, get rid of that shit altogether. Look at policy, look at specific thing. And what you will do when you look at that is that reality is a lot more complicated than one thing. Solutions are not that clear cut. So you're going to be a lot more tolerant, a lot more willing to make compromises, because you realize, you know what? That is a real problem, but there is no clear-cut 100% solution. There are some solutions that are better than others, for sure. But you can also see how it's not, and inevitably you're going to have to play a balancing game between different push and pull. That's being intellectually honest, but that's hard work. And so most people don't want to deal with it.
Yeah. And we all have biases too. So the like, and that makes it more complicated too. Like I try to think about those sorts of things all the time, but then like with that lab leak theory, for example, I just assumed it was bullshit for a long time because Trump was talking about it, and I'm not as anti-Trump as other people, but I just assume that the vast majority of what he says is full of shit. And then, I mean, I'm not convinced that the lab leak is totally true now, but it seems like it's a much larger possibility. And I just dismissed that because I just thought, well, Trump is a fucking idiot. So what does he know?
Of course. But, broken clocks and all, right? It's like, could be. Is it for sure? No. Is it a possibility? Yeah, of course. We don't really have the evidence, but there's, it's... the little tidbits of evidence definitely raise questions.
Yeah, for sure. So, it's interesting. Yeah, like you were saying, how politicized like just COVID in general became. I've just been endlessly surprised by this because I don't remember. Like, obviously, this is a like very historic event. Like there hasn't been any other time in my lifetime when there's been such a serious pandemic and lockdowns and all of these things and like being and having to wear a mask out in public. But I really didn't expect it to be so politicized. Like it seems like issues like this don't often get that politicized. But I mean, does this sort of thing happen historically, do you think? Because I hear people say that this is like historically unique, but then I've heard people criticize that too. I'm not really sure.
I mean, I think what it is this is definitely a time of extremely heightened ideological thinking, where so much of it is filtered through the lenses of ideology. Then again, it's not like when people were burning witches at the stake, there wasn't a strong ideological thinking. I think it's just a part of human nature. And why do we do it? Because life is scary and unpredictable and difficult. So we do like things that give us certainty, that give us a game plan where it's very clear what we are in favor and what we are against. Give us answers, even if they are bullshit answers, at least they are answers. You know what I mean? So I think people, the more afraid they are, the more insecure they feel, the more threatened. And the modern world is, in addition to all the existential situations, is also dramatically accelerating the speed of change. You feel like the ground is shifting under your feet all the time. It's inevitable that in the face of so much uncertainty, people would gravitate toward dogmas. That's why cult leaders and dictators are never out of business. You know what I mean? Because there's always a never-ending supply of people who are begging to be recruited into the next cult, the next political dictatorship, the next thing, because they need that kind of reassurance, which ultimately is what good quote unquote, of course, good cult leaders or dictators do, is play that father figure role who tells you, I have a good handle on it, I will take care of it all, life is gonna be good if we just follow this set of principles and that kind of stuff.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, that's so true. Like people want answers for things, and often like these issues are so complex that they don't really have answers, or at least answers that are not easy to figure out. But people want to feel more psychologically comfortable, especially in times like this with a pandemic and whatnot. So like maybe they're even more susceptible to wanting simple answers for things, and then that can So like that can perhaps lead to good things if you can change your mindset and kind of look at it with a little more nuance. But then it can get even more extreme, and then you can get the things like QAnon, for example, right? Like believing crazy shit like that Democrats are like kidnapping children and sucking their blood in pizza parlors or some shit like that.
Yep, 100%. And I think in that sense is it really is a product of fear and insecurity. And we respond psychologically. Human beings respond to fear and insecurity easily. So in a world in which clicks are power, the people who are running the media, both established media as well as alternative one, thrive on feeding fear and panic and outrage, because those are the easy triggers that will attract people's attention. That's how it goes. And then it becomes a vicious cycle. You have people who profit on this, who know perfectly well what they are doing, and they are just doing it because it brings them money and attention. Then people who are true believers, who feed the ones who profit, and it becomes this vicious cycle of things where that's why we're in trouble. That's why it's because it's very hard. It's like it's very hard to, in order to, because you're not selling an alternate dogma. That's easy. If you want to fight dogma A, you can create dogma B. That's an easy game, right? You can. Our dogma is better than theirs. But if you're inviting people to actually think on their feet and be more nuanced and be more, that's hard work. That's not an easy trade one dogma for the next kind of thing. And so that's not something that you can get masses of people behind as easily.
Yeah, exactly. Like it's a way less attractive narrative to say, okay, listen, people, I don't have answers, but let's try to figure this out together.
Yep.
It could take a lot of time and a lot of work, but we'll try to actually solve these problems instead of just giving you bullshit answers. People are like less attracted to that sort of narrative, right?
For sure, because it's requiring more out of them, and it's not delivering that quick shot, I feel better now, painkiller kind of thing that the dogmas give you by reassuring you about your anxieties on life. It doesn't. It's a much slower, less dramatic process, and it's more real. But real, unfortunately, doesn't translate into making you feel good right now.
Yeah, because like it's not saying those people are bad, we are good, we will triumph because we are good, so we will defeat the bad people. That's the same sort of narrative that Hitler had, right? Like Jews created all the world's problems. We the people will unite together to defeat the evil people and will save the world.
And I mean, even on the other side, right? I mean, that's like almost stereotypically bad, how bad that argument was, even though it was popular. But even if you look at like a kind of a leftist critique of capitalism, which you can make some strong arguments for, because when you look at the way capitalism is going, there are issues with it, clearly. At the same time, just because you recognize that there's a ton of corporate corruption and ugly things going on, and some of the nature of capitalism is not always, doesn't always lead to the healthiest human life, doesn't mean that you have a great answer to replace it. It's like, okay, we agree that there are a ton of problems with capitalism. Then what? What's the system that's going to magically fix all those things? That's a lot of a harder answer. And it's like, okay, good luck figuring that out, because it's not an easy process by any stretch of the imagination. But saying that, which is ultimately the honest thing, is not a sexy answer, because it's like, okay, now we're going to have to look at every single case, start weighing the pros and cons, tilt it 80% more this way or 20 that way. That's too complicated for most people.
Yeah, for sure.
And that's by the way a very Nietzsche thing to go on, because Nietzsche, you can accuse him of many things, and definitely being elitist was one of them. Like, he was not a big fan of the average of anything. He felt that he clearly had issue with average culture, average thinking, average philosophy, average everything. He had this sense that like the people who he had a few sentences, by the way, that are beautiful in Thus Spoke Zarathustra, where he talks about like the need of talking to people who are tall and have long legs and they can climb from peak to peak, which of course is metaphorical, right? But he's talking about people who kind of have it, who have a certain degree of awareness, ability, skill. That's not the average.
Yeah, for sure. That makes sense. Yeah,
I mean,
I agree.
Daoism does it too, it's just less angry than Nietzsche. Nietzsche gets angry about it, gets a little edgy because he would want to have more people he can interact with and can't. Daoism is more like, yeah, that's how it is. But you still can be an asshole to people. So what if somebody average? That doesn't mean you need to hate them or think they suck. It is what it is. It's like so. For if your thinking is stuck at a certain level, that's fine. Let's give you Confucianism. That's good for you. They'll prevent you from screwing up things too badly. They'll give you basic rules of behavior so you don't murder your neighbor. We're good. That's if you feel that you can afford to, then you can play with Daoist thinking that throws a lot of those rules out the window. But if you're not ready for it, you're only going to get hurt, kind of thing. So it's sort of like letting a kid play with fire. It's like, there's nothing wrong with the fire and there's nothing wrong with you being a kid, but the tool is not quite matching well with where you're at.
Yeah. Yeah, I've been starting to learn a little bit lately, and I want to learn a lot more about this, about how, like, which isn't surprising in retrospect, all the myriad or seemingly myriad disagreements between different types of Taoists and different types of Confucianists, like happens with every other type of philosophy, basically. Like people, I forget who it was, but it was another thinker who kind of another Chinese thinker who kind of heavily agreed with the Tao Te Ching or the Tao Te Ching or whoever you think about it, but he was still a Taoist. He just had a lot of interesting kind of differences and some similarities, kind of like we were talking about with other similar ideologies or religions.
Yeah, that's how it is. It's that's why, like, to me, I love, even though he didn't make it up or he wasn't the original thinker of this, it was all derivative. But I love the Bruce Lee approach of just taking what works, testing it out, dropping the ideas that don't seem to work, and constantly go over your own findings, because you're probably going to change it over time. As new information comes in, you're going to have to tweak and course correct, which I think when you think about it, that's just good scientific method, that's just good thinking, it should be, in some way, it shouldn't be brilliant and shouldn't be original. It should be just a very baseline. Like, of course, how else are you going to be? Well, except for the fact that 90% of the people don't do that. But so it's not that, of course, clearly. It's not that clear cut. But when you think about it, it's like, yeah, I mean, that's a given. How else would you be? Why would you do anything else?
Yeah, like we were talking about it, it's just so much easier to slip into that way of thinking. And a lot of people, I think forget who had that quote, but a lot of people, something about how a lot of people live unexamined lives.
Yeah.
But and it's it's understandable too. Like if some people just aren't interested in reading a lot of books and learning a lot and trying to examine their own views, and they just kind of get handed down the worldview, like their political ideology and or their religious ideology from their parents, and they're too busy because they work full time and they've got kids, and then when they get home from work they just want to relax and watch TV and go to bed, and that's totally understandable too. But then it also can lead to those sorts of problems too.
Yeah, I think the problem is then when that becomes a force recruited behind some crappy ideology because they just fed you a couple of things you like and they drew you along, then is when it becomes a problem. Otherwise, if you manage to be a sweet parent to your kids, a nice neighbor, you're a kind human being, what do I care how many books you read or how sophisticated your thinking is? Who cares? You're a good human.
Yeah.
That's it. We're good. There's nothing wrong with it. And
Yeah,
it
yeah,
becomes an issue where this more maybe not as ultra sophisticated thinking can get hijacked by the next cult leader or the next dictator or the next who knows how to push your emotional buttons. That's when it becomes a problem. Otherwise, it's not in itself.
yeah, yeah. And it's interesting too how some people can have, like, they can examine their ideologies a little bit, but tend to gravitate towards extreme ideologies. And then you have, like, for example, people who become militant atheists, and then after that they become like hardcore religious, or vice versa, or they were like a communist and then they become a hardcore conservative, or vice versa, or something like that.
100%. The mindset hasn't changed. They are just trading clothing. They are still looking for the next dogma that will explain all of their lives, that will give them meaning, that will be. So they are only trading the color of their clothing, but they are not really trading mindset. It's the same. The way they wear when they wear one thing, they are still the exact same thing when they are this new thing. They just flip the script.
Yeah, yeah. Well said. It's kind of it kind of reminds me too. I mean, about how, like, for example, a lot of militant atheists, for example, they sound super religious when they talk about religion. Like, like religion is this ultimate evil, and there's nothing good about it whatsoever. Kind of like what Nietzsche was talking about in his book called The Antichrist too,
Yep.
which, and like it shows too that, like, even super sophisticated and complex thinkers, they're not necessarily going to have nuanced views about everything too. Like, and like we were talking about with in terms of biases before. I mean, no one is perfect, and they're almost, it's like debatable whether anyone can even have like a so-called perfect worldview.
For sure. And I bet one thing that I guess before we wrap, I want to throw out there because it's one that I've been obsessed with lately because I like this story so much. I forget the origin, if it's a Sufi story or where the hell it comes from. I have no idea. But like the story is so good. He basically talks about this one person who person A arrives and say the truth is this and that, and this guy says yes, you're right. Person B arrives and he's like, no, that's not the truth. The truth is this other thing. And this guy goes like, you're right. Person C arrives and he's like, hey, they cannot both be right because they are mutually contradicting one another. And he's like, you're right. And the point of that, which seemed like a joke in a way, but is not, in the sense that most ideas contain a partial truth. You know what I mean? It's like, is there something horrible in the way organized religion have played out through human history? 100%. Can you make a very hard critique of organized religion? 100%. Can you also make an argument that there have been fantastic things that have come out of organized religion? Yeah, that too. Not in the same, we can argue about the proportion. We can say a little good, a ton of bad, or vice versa. But the point is, both are real. There is an element of truth in both. There's also an element of truth to argue, hey, you cannot put them on the same plates. It's not the same thing. It's like, the problem with so much of our thinking is that we don't just take a bad idea and run with it. We take a partially good idea, and then we run with it way further than it actually is warranted. And you take it to a place where now that partial truth turned into crap because you took it too far. And I think that's the problem of a lot of things, is like most things. I mean, even take the most awful ideology. There's something there. Maybe not none of their answer. Maybe only the fact that there was a problem there to begin with. But there's something at its origin that's not completely wrong. Where there is, take something awful like the Nazis. The Treaty of Versailles was a problem. There's no argument about it.
Yeah, I was just thinking of that.
Take the communists. Life under the Tsar sucked. It was terrible for a lot of people. There's a need there that's real. You know what I mean? They are right about that part. Then they are wrong about most everything that follows from there. But, there's something there where there's like a partial truth that got stretched too far. So you can throw away everything else that got stretched, but you can go back to the partial truth and say, well, that doesn't, just because this whole ideology sucks, that does not deny the fact that there was this original base. That was a real problem, that there was a real question to be answered. They answered it horribly, but the problem hasn't gone away. So let's figure out. And I think that's the important part of figuring out where is that even the people you disagree with the most, where is that they are right, where is that they have at least a portion where it makes sense. Because that's how you affect change. Is, nobody like to be yelled at and told, you suck, you're stupid, you're wrong. I'm gonna go on a limb and suggest that not that many people have changed their mind because you yell at them and say how stupid they are.
Yeah.
If anything, you can help change somebody's mind in a healthy way if you think that you have a healthier way, by finding a point of contact. By finding a point of contact and then gently stretching them in a direction that you think may be healthier. You don't do it by just saying your whole argument sucks.
Yeah, for sure. It's like how like you were saying with Hitler's Nazi ideology, he did have some things right, like about how the Treaty of Versailles kind of fucked over Germany with war reparations, and then there was hyperinflation in the economy, so there were a lot of problems, and it ended up leading to people looking for this like authoritarian father figure, like you were saying. And it's similar, like people have talked before about how like conspiracy theories, for example, like so-called 9/11 truth, and like
Sure.
you can go from the valid argument to saying that maybe like Bush and the American war machine already had plans to go into the Middle East, and they're like, oh, we got attacked by Muslims. That's an excuse to go and invade this Muslim country. Oh, that country didn't have anything to do with it. Well, whatever, they're still Muslims. And then people can go like to the ultimate extreme of saying it was a false flag attack and they bombed the Twin Towers themselves and that sort of shit.
Yep, 100%.
Yeah. All right. So I know you said you wanted to end it soon there. So
fortunately, it's funny. It's like lately I couldn't do. I hate when people are nice and stuff. I don't want to say no when somebody has a podcast, or it's always fun to chat. But like I couldn't do it for a while. So now like in these 2 days, I concentrated a bunch of things at once. So between yesterday and today, I'm doing 5 podcasts. So I'm like, one after that, it's like, okay, next, let's go. I'm ready for the next chat. And so I'm all like, hit a schedule.
Well, thanks, man. I always appreciate you talking with me. And yeah, this was fun. Yeah, so yeah, maybe we can talk again sometime in a little while about I know we talked a little bit about Bruce Lee, and you had said that like something that like what Quentin Tarantino was, he was kind of like insulting Bruce Lee on that Joe Rogan podcast. So maybe we can talk about Bruce Lee sometime in a little while, and I'll listen to your podcast that I know you do about it too.
I have a couple of 3 episodes on Bruce Lee, so you can check those out. Those are a good start.
Cool. All right. Well, yeah. Thanks for talking with me again, man. And I'll just say the stuff I like to say at the end here, and then you can give any plugs or last words there. And so, yeah, thanks to everyone for watching. Thanks to those of you who subscribe and hit the bell to be notified when I come out with new videos. Probably going to do either another movie chat or a book chat this weekend, either something on some Isaac Asimov short stories called The Last Question and The Last Answer, which are really awesome short stories. And thanks especially to those of you who give me money on Patreon, which I greatly appreciate. And I'll put the link in the description of the video there. And like I always say, I love you all. Keep being the tiny beam of light that shines through the almost impenetrable darkness in the universe. And most importantly, always remember this: the funk cures all, and groove is in the heart. And learn more about philosophy and history. It's really interesting. And check out Daniele Bolelli's podcasts and his books and all that kind of stuff too. So anything else you want to say before we end it there?
No, all good.
All right. Thanks a lot again, and thanks everyone for watching, and adios until next time.